Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to get started and to a very important conversation. I wanted to take a minute to introduce myself and set the stage for our conversation today. My name is Rachel Duda, and I'm the Vice President of Learning at Vivi, and I'm so happy to welcome all of you to our conversation about tackling tricky behaviors with psychiatrist, Dr. Surav Sengupta. In addition to leading the learning program at Vivi, I'm also a mom of 4 young children. So as you can imagine, I've had my share of challenging behaviors throughout the years and continue to do so on a daily basis. So I'm so excited to dig into what I know will be a very valuable conversation for all of us. Here at Vivi, it's our mission to support the whole family, not just with high quality learning and care, but also with education and resources to help with all of the ups and downs that families experience in these early years. Tricky behaviors from hitting to whining to melting down in public. If you haven't experienced these yet, guaranteed you will at some point. They're inevitably all part of the experience. So we're excited to have this conversation today, and hopefully you'll walk away with some tools to handle whatever comes your way, either now or in the near future. So if you're not already familiar with Vivi, I'm just going to give a quick overview of what we do here. Vivi is on a mission to reinvent childcare and early learning for today's families. In New York, we currently have 6 campuses that specialize in learning and care for ages 6 weeks to 5 years old. And we also partner with companies around the globe to provide childcare as a benefit to employees. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few program logistics, and then we'll dive right in. So I just want to firstly say that I appreciate all of you taking time to be with us here today. I know that you have so many things to do, and we're grateful that you could carve out time to join us. So thank you for that. We have about 45 minutes together. We'll use the first 30 minutes to run through a few questions with Saurav and share some of my own perspectives as an educator and as a parent. And then we'll head over to the chat function and use the rest of the time to answer as many live questions as possible. The chat should be open now, so feel free to drop in a question in the chat at any time during our conversation today. And then I just want to, before we jump in, just acknowledge that this conversation about challenging behaviors is a huge topic, and there's no way that we'll cover everything in 45 minutes, but I do promise you that you'll walk away with at least 1 or 2 practical applicable tools that you'll be able to put in place right away and feel more equipped to handle the next inevitable challenging behavior or meltdown. So with that, let's dig in. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Surav Sengupta, child psychiatrist and chief clinical officer at Hopscotch, an innovative virtual child therapy platform. Surav, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background, and then let's jump into why this topic is so important. Behavioral health in children. It's so critical at this stage, especially post-pandemic life. So I'll turn it over to you.
Absolutely. So hi, everybody. Surav Sengupta. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I work based in Buffalo, New York, and really fortunate to be working and connecting with this team at Vivi, and fortunate to be the chief clinical officer for Hopscotch, which is a sort of digital child therapy platform. And, in that context, I wear a lot of different hats, but I think my most important hat I wear is as a dad. So I'm a father to 2 young, wonderful little girls, certainly as a child psychiatrist. And that offers, some fun and I think, at times challenging perspectives on just sort of what's going on in terms of emotional health, mental health for our little ones. And I think these last few years have really established how challenging it can be as parents, really sort of, having a sense of where our kids are, how they're emotionally developing, what their needs are, how can I help make sure that they're getting the supports and needs that they have emotionally met, just as much as I'm worrying about their brain development, their cognitive development, their physical development, height and weight and other things. We're also, as parents, we're maybe a little bit more attuned to what's happening with our kids emotionally right now. And it's been a tough one. This is an interesting and I'd say challenging time to be both a child and a parent. We've had these, very, very significant, sort of natural disasters, if you will. The world is a very, very complicated place right now, and a challenging place to be in this space of being a parent. And in addition to that, just the way that we are with others, as parents, as people, as friends, as family, there's some big social changes going on, and figuring out how to parent our kids as they go through their own natural emotional ups and downs, while we're going through some of those as well, and some of that confusion as well, that could be a lot. So I think we need to have a little bit of kindness and grace for ourselves as we sort of figure out, next steps.
Okay, thank you. I'd love to set the stage about what we mean when we talk about tricky or challenging behaviors. So what kind of behaviors are we talking about for this age group in like the 0 to 5 range? And how do we spot them? And how do we kind of navigate what's developmentally appropriate versus what we need to, when we need to step in and address an issue?
Yeah, right. So for me, I think tricky behavior is anything, that can give me a little bit of a challenge as a parent. Something, a bit of a curveball. Kids are relentlessly creative. And sometimes they're going to find new ways to, sort of present their needs, their wants, their challenges to us as parents. That can be tricky. Sometimes though, it's also in ways that children are trying to get their needs met, and I haven't quite maybe developed a plan for that yet. And so that can be a little bit tricky. But I think one of the things that's most important to keep in mind is that it's normal to have tricky behaviors sometimes. As it turns out, especially in these younger years, in the 0 to 5, there's lots of times where we as parents are going to be a little bit flummoxed and sort of like, oh gosh, I hadn't thought through this one, or oh man, I am feeling really, at my edge here, and I've got to figure out what to do about this. So, again, giving ourselves some space around that. But I think when we're trying to sort of view, what's, kind of typical for, my kid's age, we want to just keep those kind of developmental stages in mind, and what kids are supposed to be doing at these different stages. Largely as infants, they're just kind of getting to know us and trust us so they can understand what's going on just around them. As they move off into toddler years, they're really beginning to get a bit bolder because of the security that you've given them. They're moving out into the world, they're exploring their physical environment, and they're learning that they can say no. We all have been there when our kids have, learned and discovered that. And then as they move into those kind of 4 to 5 year, range, they're really beginning to, figure out how they can be in the world, whether that's their physical environment or their social environment, and with you, and sort of figuring out relationships with others. And each of those, can be really fulfilling and fun and engaging, but sometimes they can have, trouble spots as well. And I think the space where we want to be aware of, is we want to anticipate and know that our children are sometimes going to get tripped up. And then we want to support them and give them some space, teach them some new skills and see how they're doing with that. That in of itself is normal. I think the thing to be looking out for is when, you're noticing a pattern, you're trying to help them with it, they're still continuing to struggle with it, and it's causing some challenges in their day-to-day life. It's not allowing them to do things they want to do, maybe not even allowing them to do things they need to do. Now, you could argue, what does a preschooler need to do? And we should probably think about that a little bit. And the answer may not be, all the chores or all the homework or something along those lines, but there are things that kids do need to do. They need to play with other children. They need to be able to have good relationships, maybe with their siblings or with you as their parent. And if what's happening with them is getting in the way of that, we may need to find a way to address those.
Thank you. I always like to kind of frame it as it's our job as parents to set limits and boundaries, and it's our child's job to test them, right? And they're
Yes,
really,
that's right.
right, they're really trying to figure out, in their short period of time on this earth, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And the way that they do that is by, you know, testing boundaries, testing limits, like trying something out, seeing what they can and can't get away with. And so I would say it's, more typical for children to test limits and boundaries and to have some of these challenging behaviors than it is to not. Uh,
Right.
that's kind of how they learn about the world around them. So yeah, everything that parents, I think, experiences is pretty normal. And just another thing to kind of keep in mind if you're a parent of multiple children, oftentimes you need to parent children very differently. So my oldest is 9, and then I have a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 4-year-old. I thought I was winning at the parenting thing with my oldest. He came out of the womb as a rule follower, and I like patted myself on the back, and I looked at my husband and I said, yeah, we're really like nailing this parenting thing. Like he's doing everything that he's supposed to do. He's not testing us or anything. And then my daughter came around 18 months later, and that was like a whole different world. And I
Right.
still to this day have to parent them very different. And
Yeah.
I have to deal with their behaviors and their challenges in very different ways. So that's something to keep in mind as a parent too, that children are very different, and the way that you navigate their personalities and who they are as little people can be very different.
Absolutely.
So going into kind of that, I loved reading your blog post for Vivi on how to handle meltdowns. I've experienced many myself, especially with my daughter that I was just speaking about.
Absolutely.
We're going to drop the link to that blog post in the chat for anyone who wants to take a look at that. But one of the things that you talked about in that blog post is that there are actually things that we can do as parents before that behavior actually happens. So really thinking about like being proactive. Can you talk a little bit about this approach of being proactive, preventative, and positive parenting?
Absolutely. One of the biggest things we are as parents is just observers of our children. We're trying to get a sense of how they're doing, what's going on with them. But as part of that, one of the things I think we're good at, but sometimes we need a little reminder or encouragement to that, is to be looking for patterns. We need to be sort of pattern recognizers. Okay, so it looks like every time, we're getting a little bit on the hungry side, they get a little bit more emotional. Or, hey, every time they come home from, daycare, they're a little bit riled up and they need to run around. And if we have something to do, they end up, getting into a little bit of trouble. We need to be looking for those patterns a little bit. And I think that's a big part of prevention. And when you think about a meltdown, especially for younger children, by the time it's happened, it's happening. We're not going to rewind that. We're not going to put the cat back in the bag there. It's going to play out its course, largely. But if they're happening, repeatedly in certain contexts and certain environments, we want to try to learn about that. And so one of the things we really try to ask parents to do is to sort of give our children the benefit of the doubt that something about why they're doing what they're doing is important to them. They're trying to teach us something. And I think the question that I'm always trying to ask as a parent and trying to help our parents ask, at Hopscotch is, what's sort of the function of what they're doing? Is it their way of getting a need met? They're demonstrating that they need a little bit of extra TLC right now. Or, are they saying that, I'm feeling, really, overwhelmed by all the people in this room, and I'm kind of avoiding feeling overwhelmed. And we need to sort of, look for, what are the types of environments, what are the types of situations that tend to run into this kind of behavior. And once you can identify those, it doesn't mean that we're not, explanations aren't excuses, but we can then utilize those to help them understand and teach them maybe more adaptive ways of addressing those needs, right? Rachel, how about you from your perspective? How do you think about this kind of positive parenting approach, and maybe even like the play approach here?
Yeah. I think what you talked about in terms of being proactive is really important, and kind of anticipating when these challenging behaviors are going to occur. I think, like you said, if every time you pick them up from school, they completely break down. Well, what is it? Are they tired? Are they hungry? And maybe just even bringing a simple snack with you to pick up can prevent that meltdown from happening. Or if your child has a really hard time leaving the playground when you go to the playground, preparing them for that transition to take place. Transitions are really challenging for children, or can be really challenging for children. And you probably see some of these challenging behaviors happen when it's time to change what they're doing or transition to something else. And we have to equip them with the tools to be able to do that. And so if, again, your child has a really difficult time transitioning or leaving the playground, you're going to want to give them a 5-minute warning and say, in 5 minutes, we're going to leave the playground. Would you like to take one more turn on the slide or take 2 more pushes on the swing? And
Right.
so you set the stage, right, of saying, like, this is about to happen, but then you're also giving them some control over the situation. So what would you like to do to prepare for us leaving? Do you want to go down that slide one more time? Or do you want to take another push on the swing? And so I think the more often that we can kind of equip children with tools and also give them some control and feel like they're in control of the situation, the better. Role playing and acting out different situations and modeling your expectations for them are really important. And so, especially with this younger age group, play can be so powerful. If you're dealing with a situation and you're playing alongside them or working alongside them, act it out. If you're playing with some stuffed animals, act out that situation. And kind of incorporate those tools and strategies into the play. Or if you're expecting a certain behavior out of them, model it for them, right?
Mhm.
These children have only been in the world for a short period of time. And if we have a certain expectation of a behavior from them, you have to model it. So if cleanup time in your house is challenging and children are absolutely refusing to clean up, maybe it's because they don't know how to do that. And so showing them what that looks like, these blocks go in this bin and this is how we can do it, or showing them that you're kind of part of the experience can be really powerful. So working alongside them. And I think also, like, humor can be so powerful. And so turning something into a game or
Yeah.
making light of a situation can be so powerful too. So if we've got to clean up this mess and we know that's kind of triggering for your child, let's put on a song on our, Alexa app and
Mhm.
let's clean up before the end of the song, and guaranteed children will want to beat the song, and you'll have more kind of buy-in. So I think these are just like some tips and tools and strategies that you can keep in your toolbox for when some of these behaviors, when you're anticipating some of these behaviors to occur.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, in being proactive, but we can't always, right? We can't
Yeah.
always prevent these tricky and challenging behaviors. So what about after the fact? I know so many parents sit with the regret that they didn't do something, or that they wish they had done something in the moment, or end up in a cycle of repetition with this like specific challenging behavior. What's your advice in dealing with the aftermath?
Yeah, so I think in this context, first off, when these things are happening, I think it's being humble about what one can do, right? And I think one of the biggest things to remember is that we're not likely going to talk our way out of a tantrum, or a meltdown, right? Less language, less talk is better. And really focusing in on, what's accessible to your child. This usually means a healthy dose of just physical comfort and intimacy, a little bit of positive distraction as much as can be tolerated. Again, going back to that, understanding the function, if there's another way to kind of bring that in through some physicality or through some play. I love that idea of some kind of healthy competition as well. But language is often not the way that children are going to kind of, get through this. And similarly, and just even afterwards, right after is not the time to, address this with your child either, because these are really big feelings, really big emotions. Even after they sort of come through it, it's going to take them some while to kind of settle even more. If your child is at the stage where they're kind of talking and sort of thinking through some of these things, at some point in time, I think it's okay to sort of go back and say, hey, that thing happened, that happens to me too, and sometimes when that happens, I like to try this. What if we made a game about that? That's fine, but we really need to not do that in the red zone. And I think sometimes as parents, we sort of forget because we just, we're problem solvers and we want to make sure that our kids are doing okay. But we have to be careful about kind of moving immediately into after action planning, so to speak. And then I think related to that too is just acknowledging that, just as our children are developing and growing as youngsters, we're developing and growing as parents, right? And we need to give ourselves the grace, to do that as well. And so if we can view, even challenging experiences as opportunities to learn more about my child, about myself, about the way that we interact together, you can continue to grow. Okay, I've really noticed that, when my child and I get into this pattern, it really doesn't really end up helping out. They end up going this other direction. Now it's time for me to try something different. And this is a space too where it's great to turn to others, right? Reaching out to, a friend, a family, a loved one that's recently been in a situation, something along those lines, just, kind of constantly seeking to learn. Some of your professional supports, through Vivi, through Hopscotch, through your, through your school, wherever it is, but being willing to learn. And usually what that means is also being open to being somewhat vulnerable as a parent. It's okay to say, I'm learning how to do this too, and growing with that.
I want to kind of go back a little bit. You were talking about language and how in the aftermath of some of these behaviors, less language is better. I want to talk about in the moment, like when these behaviors are kind of unfolding, because I've seen parents who are, have very kind of powerful careers and kind of lead a team of people. And when they get to their child, they sort of like crumple into these like soft mush pots. And I hear things like, honey, sweetie, we can't do that. And they try to talk a situation out with a child who's completely dysregulated. And they use this like, honey, sweetie kind of a voice. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about language kind of in the moment and how language and our voice can be such powerful tools.
Yeah. So, I think in this context, it's important to, for example, validate the child's experience, right? It can be really upsetting, when you're wanting a snack, but it isn't the time for that. You're really feeling upset right now. And you don't have to be even asking the question. We call this sort of reflection. You're just sort of stating, you're holding up an emotional mirror to the child and just kind of talking them through it. Remember, they're working on their language. So sometimes you have to voice what they're feeling for them. But this kind of, like you said, the overly questioning, the tone of our voice can communicate things to our child about sort of really frankly sort of who's in charge and who's kind of in the decision-making role right now. And so I think this is a space to, take that deep breath, save a few things that you need to talk through for your, parenting partner later on. But here, you got to kind of own this space. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to do this, matter of fact. Now, and what we want here is right in the middle. We don't want really elevated, high pitch, high volume. We don't want to get too, kind of meek as well. We want to be just right in the middle. And by doing that, we're teaching them that, hey, emotional ups and downs happen. We talk through them, but right here, right now, mom, dad, uncle, aunt, whoever's in caregiving mode right now, I'm the one that's in charge. I'm going to tell us what's going to happen next. I think that's really important.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, your voice and your tone can be so powerful. In a lot of the questions that came in earlier and also that are coming in the chat now, people are asking about things like biting. And I think this is kind of a situation and hitting as well, where less language is better. And so, and your tone of voice is really powerful and important. So we don't bite, that hurts. And then removing your child from the situation rather than over talking kind of a situation like this. It's just not effective. A child, when they're kind of dysregulated in that moment for whatever reason, is not able to take everything that you're saying in. And so I always like to say firm but loving. You want to go in firm, but you want to have that warm kind of presence as well, that I'm here for you and I'm going to support you through this. But that's not okay. And I think a lot of parents kind of are wondering about, what are consequences for behavior? Do I do a timeout? Is that effective for a child? And I always like to think about kind of the punishment needs to fit the crime. And I've seen a lot of families, if their child spills water on the table, they'll go put them in a timeout. And that's not, in my opinion, right? Like that's not
tough, right?
Exactly. It's not an effective.
You don't have the motor development for it.
Exactly. Right. And so a logical consequence in that situation, if your child spills water on the table, or if your child draws with marker all over the table, is not to put them in a timeout, or is not to, go to bed at night without any stories. But the logical consequence would be, you spilled the water and you need to clean it up. So let's go over and get some paper. If we make a mess, then this is what needs to happen. If we draw on the table with markers, markers are for paper. We don't draw on tables. Now we need to clean that up. And so like the punishment always has to fit the crime. If you have a child who, if you're going out for walks and is running far ahead of you and is not being safe, walking down the street, then the logical consequence is, then you need to hold my hand, or you need to sit in the stroller. That's the logical consequence. It's not, again, like taking sweets away for the next month. And so like, I think like parents really thinking about that, like what's the behavior and what can be the consequence, but it has to be completely connected. The punishment has to fit the crime.
Yeah. And I think with that too, and so, I don't want to speak, down towards children, but keep in mind that ultimately children are still in a bit of a gambling phase, and their job is to maximize their pleasure, their fun, they're going to take the chances that they see. So a lot of times with logical consequences, you're helping them learn that, A leads to B leads to C, and you're teaching them. So if you can view sort of consequences as education, right? And what you're trying to help them understand though, is that, that the gamble really doesn't pay off. Right. That, running off in this kind of situation is always associated with this type of, end result, which is not fun for me. So then it becomes less interesting.
Absolutely. And kids are relentless, and they know when to push your buttons, push your boundaries. I love to tell the story about when my daughter, who I spoke about earlier, she's got a very strong personality. And she's been testing limits since she was born. But this goes back to when she was about 4 years old. And she woke up one morning and said, "Can I have ice cream for breakfast?" And I said, no, you can't have ice cream for breakfast. And the next day she woke up and said the same thing. "Can I have ice cream for breakfast?" "No, you can't have ice cream for breakfast. That's not an appropriate breakfast food." And then day 3, day 4, day 5 came, and she was still asking me. And I started to like have this inner conversation with myself of, well, maybe she can have ice cream for breakfast. There's milk in it. Milk is healthy. But like, I know, like you have to, as a parent, if you say something, the follow through is so important.
It's key.
If you give in at any moment, they know they can like smell your weakness.
Oh yeah.
And they're going to pounce. Right. And so I always say to parents, as hard as it is to kind of hold your ground and stand your ground with something, you have to, because the minute that they know that they can get away with it, they're going to do that for every situation. And so holding firm to the boundaries and the limits that you set in your home are just, I'm telling you, it's like the most powerful thing.
And just acknowledging too, for all of us as parents, just acknowledge it's not an easy experience emotionally for us. it's not fun, to sort of feel like by what I'm doing, it's contributing to, let's say, my child, being tearful or feeling upset. And I think this is where you have to, my general sort of mind frame on this is, I'm raising my child now, but I'll always be their parent, and so doing this now is helping my child 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. I'm both of their parents. I have to be their parent in this moment, but I'm going to be their parent forever. And if I want my future child to be doing okay, I have to do this work now, even though they're gonna express a lot. That's kind of on us as the parents to be able to sort of tolerate their distress. And that's one of those parenting skills that can grow over time with experience, with help.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about how parents can tell if some of these behaviors and challenges kind of go outside of the developmental norms, and what to do if a parent suspects that their child might need some extra help or intervention?
Absolutely. Right. So, I think first and foremost is, when you're first noticing something, like we were talking about earlier, you want to give it some time. Even kids that are a little bit different, they still have that natural developmental time course, and a lot can happen very, very quickly. So you want to give it, but let's say these things are continuing to be an issue, let's say, one of the first sets of resources I always, advise parents to use is, any other adult that regularly works with both your child and lots of other kids. So maybe it's one of the great folks at the early childhood center or daycare or preschool. Sometimes even this is just a good friend that spends, maybe is a little bit farther along in their parenting journey. Sometimes it's our extended family, previous generations, if you're fortunate enough to have folks like that. But you want to, it's good to be able to have someone that you can, kind of bounce things off of. But I think in general, the biggest thing, again, it goes back to, does what's happening, is it keeping my child from things they want to be doing and need to be doing in terms of where they are developmentally? And again, they're young children. They don't need to be doing a whole heck of a lot, but they do need to be doing some things. They need to be learning about the world, about their physical environment, how to play with other children, how to be in a relationship with someone that cares about them, how to keep themselves safe. And so if some of these things are, I think the first, great person to talk to is your pediatrician. These are folks that are experts in child development. They see lots and lots of kids. They help lots and lots of parents along those lines. And then sometimes, working with your pediatrician, you may decide, okay, I need to work with some folks to help my child with their gross motor development or their language skills or their social, engagement. Sometimes that'll be someone that can maybe even come out to your home and help you kind of do some assessments and, teach you all some skills. Sometimes that might be a therapist or a counselor that's going to, and interestingly, sort of play with your child to help teach them things and also sort of coach and guide you on how to do that as well. Our different organizations, are involved in sort of supporting this kind of work, whether it's through early childhood work, whether it's through, for us kind of, connecting families with therapists through hopscotch. But, the biggest thing is not to suffer in silence and alone. Get help, invite some more people to this party, because, even though our challenges feel unique and challenging, other folks have been through this and we want to learn from them as well.
Absolutely. I always say to parents, don't worry alone. So if you have something that's on your mind, there are lots of people there to support you. And I'm a big advocate of giving your family and your child the supports that they need, because it's going to make your home life and your family life more pleasant. Because if you're kind of stuck in these challenging and tricky behaviors all the time, how that can kind of wear on you as a parent, and you want to enjoy this time of life. And so I always think it's a great option to ask for help. Yeah. Okay. We have some great questions coming into the chat.
All right.
So let's get to it. One of the questions that seems to be a hot topic is kind of surrounding food and meal times. So how do families navigate the challenging behavior of throwing food, pushing food off the plate, or just like, I don't like this food, I'm not going to eat it. And what do parents do with that?
Yeah. So I think this is one of those things where obviously there's going to be some very stage dependent things here. For infants and early toddlers, just as parents, we're going to have a little bit of extra kind of patience and understanding, because really food exploration is also physical environment exploration, is also social exploration. It's really beginning to learn a new thing. But from a relatively early standpoint, we want to establish good role modeling behaviors. And this is a space where I think sometimes as parents, we have to be almost a bit theatrical. Trying a new thing, that's the time to be like, I have never had okra before, thanks so much, Bob, Dad, I'm gonna pick that up. And oh my gosh, it's so interesting. It feels different. I really like that. And I've never had, and kind of making a little bit of a show, if you will, about that. If and when you are at the place where you're setting some firm expectations about some behaviors, and Rachel, you were talking earlier about follow through. There is no such thing as a good rule without good follow through. And so if one thing is, let's say, about pushing food off onto the floor, and you've established, you thought it through with your parenting partner, and you've established a good consequence. Okay, maybe that means a pickup and a replacement of that or a similar type of food. You got to follow through on that regularly, right? And what I will say about that, though, that's not a space to get super heightened or to ignore or get meek about. Just you got to stay in that kind and firm zone, but you need to follow through on that as well. And I think it's okay to sort of say, hey, we have a regular plan B. Early child years are a lot about trying to expand their palate, but there's some developmental challenges around that sometimes. So if they've got a good nutritious thing that it's a usual plan B, sometimes you can incorporate that into mealtime too.
Yeah. And I think there are very few things in life that children can control, especially young children. And one of that is eating, and the other one's toileting. And so a lot of challenging behaviors come around those two pieces. One thing that I started to do in my house many years ago when my children were young is start to serve food family style. Again, it's about control. When children feel like they have some control over a situation and that you're not the one that is making decisions for them, the outcome is going to be better. And so what I typically do is I put out some, everything that we're going to be eating that night. I put it into bowls with spoons or forks in the middle of the table. And I started to do this when my children were younger. So even kind of like, the 18-month-old mark, that children were able to, my children were able to start making choices about the food and the amount of food that they want on their plate. And it would always be where I would choose a few items that I know they were going to eat that they like. And then there would be the addition of some new foods that maybe they weren't as familiar with. And, they were able to make decisions, but the more you expose children to food, the more comfortable and familiar they're going to be with it. But I would definitely encourage people to try that family style approach to meal times. Because again, it's giving your child some control over what they're putting on their plate and how much they're eating. And I think you'll see some kind of shifts in the right direction there with some behaviors, because again, it's about control for them. Another question that came through the chat earlier was about public tantrums or public behaviors. And let me tell you, there is nothing worse than being in a grocery store and having your child completely melt out on the floor, or going back to that playground situation, like, being that parent that has the child that's completely broken down in the playground. How do you deal with those public situations?
Those are so tough. So first and foremost is grace for yourself, right? And acknowledging that these are really, really challenging situations and sort of special circumstances around them. But they're also big learning opportunities for kids. And sometimes, when you're able to kind of navigate it, and that's what they're learning. But remember, on the other side, if very, very different rules apply and we sort of accommodate everything, in public, that's a learning experience for our children as well. And so I think this is one of those spaces where as parents, we have to resolve a little bit that, okay, I'm going to largely keep the same set of structures even in public. And I think that means having a little bit of a plan B around that, right? If a big part of it is, kind of, let's say, needing extra attention from parent, a tantrum in the grocery store, right? We can't have that then be the thing that gets them lots of attention from parent. So we may need, the plan B may need to be some selective ignoring, even in the middle of the grocery aisle. I have absolutely both been that parent and been the other parent that's given the, other parent a kind look of just like, hey, I know you're doing it. It's okay. But also I think as parents, sometimes we have to tolerate the distress. We have to tolerate the distress that our children are exhibiting. And also sometimes, we want to be kind to others, but sometimes people are not kind always. You might have comments and things, and you just have to know you're doing what's best for your child, which is teaching them that this is ultimately a behavior that's going to be useful for them in life. Right. And it's just sort of sticking with that. But I think also just around that, planning things out, right? Having those, go to alternate activities, a little bit of positive distraction, finding out what can be useful in those situations. I think as much as you can preventive before meltdown.
Absolutely. We, I early on in kind of my parenting journey, I started to take my children out to eat at restaurants. It's something my husband and I like to do, and we wanted to incorporate our children into that as well. To kind of avoid those challenging behaviors or that restlessness that can come with like having to sit and wait, rather than giving them an iPad or a phone, which is not something that we do in our family. We have a fun bag, and we pack a fun bag before we go to a restaurant.
Yes.
There's some crayons, and there's a coloring book, there's some paper. And I think, again, it's like being proactive versus reactive, right? Like knowing that they're going to have to sit and wait, just anticipating some of those challenging behaviors and making it a fun experience for everybody. I think we have time for one more question. There's lots of questions in the chat and even beforehand. And you're always, feel free to email either myself at rachel@vivi.com or, any of the team here. Biting and hitting, and those like physical behaviors, which can be really challenging to navigate, not only at home, but if you do have a child in a school setting and they're biting, that brings about a lot of big feelings for parents, and it can be really hard. What's your advice there?
Yeah, that's a tough one as well, right? As a parent, if as a parent your child is bit, that's obviously very, very distressing and challenging. We don't want that. As a parent, your child is biting, that's of concern as well. So I think one of the things is, again, trying to understand what is underlying that behavior. And biting is one of those ones where it could actually be many different things. And so if you're getting a chance to observe it, it's really trying to be curious about like, what was going on in the 30 minutes or so before, or before, prior in that day. If it's happening in early childhood, preschool, daycare, it's really working with your partners there, sort of saying like, I really need to know what's happening before, like there has to be some pattern here and I want to try to untangle it with you. One thing I will say is, once it's happened though, we do need to find a way to kind of, and again, we're not going to do some major aversive experience. They're a young child, they're still learning, but generally, the school of thought is we remove them. We remove them from social engagement so that they can't kind of get reinforced by, further, peer engagement, but also they can't get really further reinforced by a lot of extra adult engagement in that moment. It doesn't mean that we're not going to, address their concerns later, but in that moment, we have to teach them that the next step that happens after biting is a little bit of me socially not being able to engage, right? But then, once we've found out some of the patterns, what we are then looking for is what to do on the preventative side, on the upside. So one thing you may find is that sometimes if children are needing a little bit more TLC, and that seems to be some of the things leading up to biting, you don't do it after a bite, but you're looking for what are those kind of yellow flag signs beforehand, and that's when you give them the TLC. And then what you're doing is you're retraining them to sort of connect yellow flags then with getting help. And then, as they move further and further along into maybe verbal or nonverbal expression, you're sort of trying to get that connected to getting some support and help. But you do have to disconnect the biting behavior from something that's positively reinforcing, which is super challenging again as parents, because when that happens, my instinct is to scoop them up and say, what's going on? And we have to try not to do that. But once we figured out those patterns, go back and try to give it to them on the way up.
Yeah. And I think going back to what we were talking about earlier is less language is better. Biting hurts. You may not bite your friend. You may not bite me. Biting hurts. And that's all the language that you're using. One of the parents in the chat mentioned that if the biting or the hitting is directed towards me as a parent, I can't necessarily take them out of the situation. One thing that that can be really powerful is rather than like taking your child out of the situation, take yourself out of the situation. Yeah. So it's like taking a break as a parent and saying, you may not bite me, you may not hurt me. That makes me feel sad. I'm going to take a break.
Yeah.
And actually like going into your room, if it's safe to do that, and removing yourself from the situation. And that's, again, like a logical consequence of like, you hurt me, I need some space right now, but also being able to model that language for your child to say, that hurts, I feel frustrated, or I feel sad, whatever it is, I need to take a break and walk away. And so like that can be a really powerful situation, in a lot of different cases. And
again, and I know it's frustrating and challenging as a parent. Oh my gosh, I'm turning my back on my child. But just keep in mind, you're the parent for them now and in the future, right? And this process is teaching them something really important.
Absolutely. Just think to those teenage years when things get really complicated and complex, but the foundation that you lay now
that you're setting now
going to serve them well during those times.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody in the audience for joining us. We know that there's still so much to cover. So like I said, please reach out to any of us. Parenting is hard. Parenting is intense, but we're so appreciative that you made the time for us today and hopefully walked away with something that's going to support your parenting journey. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Be well.
Have a great day.